And we got a couple of things on the agenda. First thing we have is, Bill, let's talk about the 5-year plan first, okay? So we've been waiting for these 5-year plans for at least 5 years. And we have a lot of it in detail, and I think Mr. Hartzell is gonna give us the rundown of the 5-year plan. Mr. Mayor is here as well, and so is Mr. Joe McMahon. I almost said McMahon. Joe McMahon. So I think Mr. Hartzell is going to take over, right?
I guess I'm talking about this, yes, because I should have done better than anybody else since I put it together. This is indeed what should have been presented to you at the end of 2017 and the 5-year operating plan for the city of Allentown for the years 2018 to 2022. What I'm going to explain here in the first couple of slides is how we got to this point, and from that, we will then have a discussion about the assumptions that were made in the model. So, next, I get this. Alrighty, let's see if I can do this right. The arrow is supposed to work. Is it working in which direction? Oh, I see.
Let me get this screen up.
Where am I
Just
supposed to?
keep hitting it to see if it'll work.
What is it?
Maybe that return.
There's not a touch screen up there.
That's not just my first time.
So I was hitting the arrow keys, I thought that was the one.
Yeah, it's not working. I got it under control.
Okay, you got this?
There we go.
Let's take a look, go back one. There we go. Presentation outline, I'm going to start off with understanding of changed economic assumptions from the 5-year plan that was presented with 2017 budget in November of 2016, and then get into the data assumptions and the key findings thereof. Talk a little bit about special purpose fund effects on the general fund, and then deal with financial factors moving forward. And I will be very clear about how we came up with the assumptions that we did, so that you at least have a clear idea of how we started this and what went into the calculations. So let's take on the next slide. You will recall that when we presented the 5-year plan, or I should say I presented it along with the former mayor in November of 2016, that we had an assumption in that document. There was a request to put the resident earned income tax all the way up to 2%, of which 1.5% would come to the city. And we had an implementation of the stormwater management fee that was going to equalize the anticipated general fund revenues and expenditures in those 4 years. I want to go back for a minute and talk about where we were when I arrived here in the autumn of 2015. In the autumn of 2015, using what I would consider to be a similar set of assumptions as to what I'm going to show here, we had a fundamental structural deficit of about $8 million in the general fund. And that pattern was rising over time, like 10 to 12, 13, 14. Some people saw that board in my office all the time that I was looking at, saying that that overall pattern was going up. The intention of those 2 EIT increases, along with the implementation of the stormwater fee, was that the existing structural deficit that we had at that point would be covered completely, and it almost did. But a couple of things have happened since then. There was a decision made by the aggregate pension board of the city to lower the expected investment return rate on our fire and police and O&E pensions by 25 basis points. So we now factor in, instead of 7.75% as a return for fire and police, 7.5%, which, given the returns in the market these days, is a much more reasonable assumption of what our return is going to be. But that does mean that we end up paying a bit more in our MMO payment to the state. That shows what our overall contribution is to be sure that our pensions are kept healthy. And we also updated mortality tables to be more realistic with how long people are living compared to the tables that we had before. These were much more realistic. Those items were largely the contributors to what was a $3 million increase in the bottom line in the recurring costs and the city pension costs. That was the big item. I only mentioned the other item on there because we ended up coming to an income tax rate that was a little under 2%, and the impact of that revenue change comes up to about $500,000 annually. And I wanted to just factor that in to show what the impact was going from 2%. But I know that that decision was a very carefully made one amongst all of us, and respect that completely. I just wanted to point out that that did have an annual impact from what we were expecting on the revenue side. Take on the next slide. So here are the data assumptions that come into the model that you're about to see. Take the 2018 city budget as it is implemented and incorporate that as the baseline year. And so that's the starting point for what you see for 2018 with the deficit that's going to be accompanying what you see in your accompanying work stuff. The revenue and cost projections of the 2017 assumption that we showed a year ago were largely maintained for 2018, and I'll go into some more detail on that in the next couple of slides. And very importantly, city government employment was held steady during the planned timeline. So what I mean by that is that current operation levels, current number of employees, current number of services were assumed as continuing going through the proposal. So it doesn't start from a point that is, what if we did X or what if we did Y? It was assuming the existing operations that we have in the city, and then taking from that point some expectations in terms of both cost increases and revenue adjustments. So given that, let's go on to the next slide. While he is pulling that up, I do know what the next slide is, and I'll go ahead and start reading off of that one while he gets it up there. Let's start off with the assumptions that were made on expenditures. In the previous year's 5-year plan, we made an assumption that permanent wages were going to increase annually by 2.5%. We maintained that 2.5% assumption through the whole of the model here, and there are some cases in which, with the collective bargaining agreements, in which we're seeing 3% increases at least for the next couple of years. So the 2.5, I think, was a reasonable assumption to maintain when it came to permanent wage increases. We maintained the factor of the vacancy factor as it has historically been, which has been pretty constant for the last 5 years, just to point out that our expenditures on wages were going to go up at a certain expected pace. Health insurance costs were increased annually by 7%, which has been a historic record that we've seen. There we go, what we've seen in recent years. We also assumed that the increased base in 2018 would be thrown into the pension cost model, and then we utilized the current actuarial estimates for the 4 years that follow it. On the matter of item 46, account 46, the professional services budget, we have not been above $5.2 million in any year going up through 2016. Those numbers are probably going to go up a little bit in the next couple of years, and so I made an assumption of keeping that budget steady at $6 million the entire time of the duration of the plan. We took electric and fuel equipment costs and increased them 2% per year. Obviously, that could be much more volatile given what's been happening with energy prices of late. We include fully the solid waste fund loan repayment to 2023 on a straight line basis that is paying back about $640,000 a year from the general fund to the solid waste fund. And we also have no long-term debt, new long-term debt issued through the entirety of the period, though there will be an assumption of short-term equipment needs factored into the debt service for 2018. And that is then repeated through the subsequent years. So that covers the expenditures. Let's go over the revenues. On revenues, we made some different assumptions with respect to certain categories. Real estate taxes have not increased to the extent that we had originally thought they would in recent years. So we did a 1.5% increase in that category. We raised the earned income tax by 2.5%, and because we have had some robust collection in business privilege tax of late, we increased that annually by 3% rate. Most of the fees that are issued by the city for things like licensure, inspections, et cetera, we increased by 1%. So keep that in mind. That could end up being something too conservative an estimate. We kept our grants unchanged from the current revenue level. We continue to assume eligibility under Act 205 to assess non-resident earned income tax, which comes to the city at about $4 million per year. The impact of increasing the MMO in the new assumptions that were made on returns on the pension funds is actually giving us a pretty good numerator in the calculation that the Auditor General will look at, in which I'm expecting that we will continue to be eligible to collect the Act 205 tax on non-resident earned income for the duration of the period. We include in here the $500,000 annual royalty fee from the Lehigh County Authority adjusted for inflation, tied to the concession lease. And we do a 3% annual increase in the state aid for pension, as well as a 2% annual increase in the casino revenue from 2017 base. And so, given the assumptions, pull the curtain away. There we go. The annual structural deficit as a result of this is approximately $4 to $5 million through 2022. But unlike where we were late in 2015, early 2016, when we had a path that was starting up here and continuing to rise, now we've got one a bit lower, and it's holding fairly steady. A little bit of an uptick in the last couple of years. Now, I had said when we had this conversation, when we introduced this before, the next part about personnel costs primarily driving continuing expenditure increases. I want to point out, so I was looking through our data for 2016 versus 2017 in the cash accounts, that we were, as far as the monthly reports, in the third December report that we showed at the end of 2017, to show exactly how much we had been spending in cash over the course of the year. Now, you won't have this particular piece of paper, I did. The amount that we spent outside of personnel and debt, or here's what we showed in cash as having spent. I'm looking at all the accounts from 20 to 72 for services and charges, materials and supplies, and equipment. In 2016, according to our end-of-year summary on cash that we did for the end of 2017, we spent a grand total of $12,919,000 on that aggregate set of items. That's everything except debt, risk, personnel costs. $12,919,000. In 2017, that aggregate number actually went downward to $12,671,000. This is the point that I was trying to make on a recent occasion, that we are actually doing a pretty good job of controlling non-personnel spending, and the implications thereof. We still will have a lot to discuss in the budget process. Does that mean that we're spending the right amount and we've actually got it in place, or does it mean something else? And we get into the budget, I think we will have that discussion very well. But it does indicate to me that outside of the personnel sector or the debt sector, that we have our costs nominally under control. So let's take a look now at the personnel costs. In that same particular couple of years, let's stay back one for a moment. Thanks. The costs that we were showing under personnel, and this is everything that include wages and benefits, including pension costs and insurance. We were at $73,273,000 for 2016, and we went up to $76,361,000 for 2017. And the bulk of that difference happened in terms of health insurance costs, the increase a little bit in the pension cost, and also the wage increases that we have seen in the last year or two. If you take away those particular items, everything else holds pretty close to the same, and has not gone up to a significant amount. But we are paying our people a higher wage. We have to cover the pension costs adequately to make sure that the pensions are funded. We have insurance costs that are increasing about 7% per year. So all of those things added up are the reason why our personnel costs are shooting up. In the past year, they went up about $3 million, so we're pretty close to 4%. So now go ahead and go on to the next slide. That is where the driver of the costs in the existing model we have happens. If we continue to do things the way we've been doing them the last few years, I expect we will have pretty much stable costs with respect to non-personnel costs. I expect that we're actually going to be topping out a little bit in the next 5 years with respect to some of our debt items, although those numbers clearly have gone up in recent years. But the main thing that's going to continue to move upward in overall cost is going to be personnel costs, for the reasons that I've laid out. Now let's talk special purpose funds briefly here. The current appropriation levels within the Trexler Fund, the Liquid Fuels Fund, and the Stormwater and Solid Waste Funds are assumed in the model. And we have had some steady expectations both on the revenue and expenditure side that I am not expecting in any way that there's going to be any effect negatively on the general fund from any of the activities that transpire during the 5 years in those particular fund areas. Obviously, those funds do contribute a little bit of a general fund service charge to the city for general administration, which we do collect on a steady basis. The equipment fund has been serving as the repository for short-term debt to cover fleet, IT, and short-term equipment needs. And it is our intention to continue doing that. We have used up the $6 million 3-year loan that expired at the end of last year. The short-term loan that we're proposing to come up with, which we have budgeted for, will extend that a little bit longer, but after that we have some very significant decisions to make because we are, as in my opinion, that we're already up against a reasonable debt limit as far as the percentage of the general fund that is going for debt purposes. Changes in available revenue, of course, is that they may require additional support from the general fund. I don't see it coming at this point. If something changes to that effect, I just say there's always the possibility. I will definitely let you know as soon as something were to change in that regard. Let's go to the last slide. Here were the two major points that came out of this, and Ms. Opilo tweeted on this significantly when this first came out, and I want to touch on them both in some detail. First of all, that no significant expenditure reductions can occur without either decreasing staffing or decreasing the current level of provision of public services. This simply goes back to what I was saying in the last couple of slides. We have controlled our expenditures when it comes outside of the personnel sector. I think that we are heading toward a cap or a top that's sustainable in terms of our debt finance in the next few years. But the overall cost driver that continues with the operations that we're doing is the personnel side. And so if there's going to be, as some have hoped for, a significant cut in our overall costs, the only place in which that's going to move is going to be with personnel. However you all choose to take that and how you choose to disagree, I have no problem with that, but I've tried to lay out why that is the issue. Also, the second part of this, which is dealing with our debt capacity, is that the capital improvements necessary for continued service provision at current quality, we can't really take out a whole lot more out of long-term debt to be able to cover those things at this point. I regret that in 2015 there was a debt issue that went out, a rather significant one that did not include any new revenue to accompany that cost, and so we've been paying for that debt out of the general fund. Our debt as a contribution to general obligation was $5.2 million a year in 2014. It went up to $8.1 million for 2018. Now you're talking numbers that are at a state that we dare not go beyond with respect to the percentage of the general fund being used to pay off debt service. And so we have almost no flexibility at this point to assume longer-term debt. And so if we were to do any additional capital improvements, we would likely have to do pay-as-you-go at this stage. And that would cut into the general fund reserves even further. So I wanted to lay this out as clearly and cleanly as possible. This is my best estimate of seeing where things are at, given that we're keeping current operations going forward. And I will be happy to take any questions from any of you and from the public.
Thank you, Mr. Russell. I do have a couple of questions. I'm going to start with my left, bar left. See if you have a question, come back to me if I have a couple of questions. Go ahead, Mr. Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm always happy to be considered on the far left. So. Thank you very much, Mr. Hartzell. That was a very detailed explanation. You actually did answer a couple of the questions that I had. The ones that are remaining, I'll try to go through pretty quickly. So we're looking at somewhere around 7 or 8% for a debt ratio at this point.
Yes, in terms of what goes out for general operation debt. And there's another little top on that in terms of what needs to go into the risk fund to deal with potential liabilities of the city legally. That would probably run another 2%.
Okay. What's a healthy debt ratio for us to have? What should we be shooting for long term? The best guess.
I would be very happy to get that down around 5%. Okay. I mean, if we kept it in that range, I think that's a very reasonable amount to go to. I do know that there has been some concern raised. Standard & Poor's mentioned it somewhat recently that our position on the debt as it currently stands is weak. I think if we got it down to about 5%, that we would be in a much more stable position, and that's a manageable debt to go forward.
Okay, and then that's also going to be helpful for us with our bond rating and everything else.
All that other stuff, yes.
Exactly, so that is a big concern. So you answered that question for me. Where are we on track with revenue and expenditures for the year? Do you feel confident where we are?
At this point, yes. And we'll show the April report in a minute, and in terms of the general fund, I am seeing pretty much what I have seen at the same point of the year the previous 2 years, that revenues and expenditures are coming in very similar to what they were in the previous couple of years in terms of the percentage of overall that we're seeing. So I'm not seeing anything unusual with that.
All right, thank you. Concerning the vacancy factor, where you talk about here how your estimate is that city government employment will stay steady during the planned timeline. I just have a concern with that because I know that Mayor O'Connell's push is to fill a lot of these jobs, more so than the previous administrations. So my concern is that that's going to throw off the financial plan and how much that's going to throw it off.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk a little bit about that at all?
I think that historically, and I was a little surprised by this when I looked into it, is that that vacancy factor has been holding very constant for a period of several years. And I think a lot of that is simply explained by the natural attrition of people coming in and going out in the system. If, as the mayor is doing, we are trying to fill up as many of those positions as possible, I think the long-term behavioral issues in terms of attrition are still going to remain, but it could be very well possible that we lower that expected rate of the vacancy rate. It will come down a couple 100,000 perhaps. In which case, yeah, we're going to see a little bit more of a push, pressure on wage increases going up.
Okay. And then in concern with that, I also am curious if you're concerned about any fluctuation in your estimates on expenditures for salaries based off of the pay study.
A very good question. I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out of the pay study and the responses that we're going to need to make as a result of that. I think no matter what comes out of that study, it's important, as everybody around in this room who is concerned about this has said, that we need to come up with a fair and reliable source for determining how people are compensated in the city that is based upon the type of work that they do, the type of merit that's involved with that. And so I'm looking forward to seeing what's going to come out of the study, regardless of what may happen. I realize what our fiscal constraints are at this point, which is going to have some impact of it, but we still need to see the results of the study and figure out how to integrate those going forward.
Okay. You had discussed the professional service budget, which was my question, one of my questions as to where that was, and it seems like it's been relatively consistent the last 5 years, so
Mhm.
it seems like a good estimate.
And I decided to go on at 6 million, which might be, we've had a few things this year dealing with the end of the stormwater assistance that we had contractually. We've got some new contracts coming up, I think, dealing with the comprehensive plan this year. And obviously our fleet management contract is a very significant one as part of that overall total. But the overall number, even though the budget has been significantly higher, we've not topped 5.2 million a year. I think the overall trend is continuing to go up a little bit, so I thought 6 million was a pretty reliable number to go with annually for the period.
Okay, my next question, if you don't have these numbers, I understand, if you could just get them to me.
Sure.
Just a rough idea of what the increase over the last 5 years was with the electric fuel equipment that led you to the conclusion as to that the increase would be, I think roughly it was 2%, so yeah, 2%.
Yeah, actually, I can speak to that in terms of both the fuel and the electric, is that in the case of the fuel, in 2014, that overall cost did shoot up a whole lot when energy prices were coming up very highly. They were coming down rather significantly through 2016 to 2017 when things came down. I've talked to Craig Messinger about that issue particularly, whether the increase that we've been seeing in energy prices lately would be justifying making another big upswing in that. And I know that the contracts that we have in place with our providers provide some stability in that regard that I think we're not immune from, but we're somewhat sheltered from some of the whipsaw changes that have been happening in those costs. And we actually are spending less on electric power now than we were doing in 2013, I believe, when I was looking at the sheets for this.
Well, I remember that we picked up a new supplier and
Yes.
stayed significant on that, so that was it. You answered my question about short-term debt with the debt ratio, and what led you to the assumption on your revenue increases, that the percentages increased in property taxes and earned income tax and everything else?
I have been a bit surprised that when we come to property tax revenue, that it has not increased more than in the last 3 to 4 years than I expected it would. But we are seeing several very large office buildings, not only that have already come online, right, along with some apartments complexes as well, but we have a couple of giant buildings that are on the way that are going to have a significant impact, I think, on those calculations going forward. We're expecting, obviously, the waterfront to get going here pretty soon. That's pretty much where the driver is going to be with respect to property taxes. And after looking over that number, I didn't feel comfortable going higher than 1.5% for an annual increase, given that at the present time. We're seeing much more robust growth in earned income tax, and I think 2.5% on the existing rates that we have. It may be a skosh optimistic, but I don't think so. I think we're seeing that kind of growth year over year, and we have a bustling economy at the moment. So I think that that's a reasonable assumption to make. What we've been doing with respect to business privilege tax has been a much more aggressive auditing procedure, going over large swaths of previous audits and discovering that there was additional money that should have been collected. We're actually in the process of collecting it right now. I suspect the main numbers that we're going to show with respect to collection of EPT are going to be almost to the point that we've projected for the entire year, in fact. Although there is still going to be a little bit of that money that will be leaving us to go to the NIS as part of their escrow, but we'll still have some more collections coming in later in the year. So that one was a little sunny, 3%, but I think what we're seeing at this point justifies it on an annual basis.
The EMS transfer fees, do you feel that that's a little, that you're confident that that's what will rise by? Do you feel it might be a little optimistic? Because I know we've had issues with it in the past, so.
Oh, yes, and I see Mr. Glazier smiling quite happily at this moment to have this discussion. I think probably, I don't want to say I probably was too optimistic on that in terms of revenue, in terms of what we were going to get as far as penalty collections for people who utilize the service more than 2 times for non-medically necessary purposes. I would say, however, because Eric Gratz has shown me the information on this, that we're not seeing the impact on the revenue side, we are seeing it on the cost side. Because according to Eric, we have seen year over year a 74% decrease in non-medically necessary emergency calls. So while it's not showing up on the revenue side, it is showing up on the cost side. So I'm not sure that we're netting out quite to the point that I would expect that we would, but it's definitely having that impact. And what's interesting about this, and this leads to the point of why having those 2 extra paramedics is so important, is that we've actually seen an uptick in the regular calls that are putting our overall call volume right about where it's been historically. It's just now made up of a lot more medically necessary phone calls than we had in the past. So there were perfect reasons to go ahead and bring on additional people.
Absolutely, no, less calls, we're losing the mutual aid in that sense. So, I have just one or two more questions. The extra duty jobs for the police department, I actually had 2 questions that are relatively related here, if I can find my other page. Where is this here? Basically, my question was on the extra duty jobs, are we keeping any of the money, or actually, here we go. In expenditures where you have line 7, the extra duty pay of 601,000, 2018 final budget going up to 663,422, 2022 projected. Is that just the police extra duty jobs, or is that separate from that?
It is police.
So we're actually spending $200,000 on the extra duty jobs.
Well, it's supposed to be lined up that whatever we're taking in revenue is lining up with the actual costs that are set up there. It's supposed to be a revenue wash. If I don't have it in there that way, I need to fix that.
Yeah, it's actually off by about $180,000.
That's my mistake.
Okay. If we could just get the updated numbers on that, I would
Sure.
appreciate that.
Absolutely.
And my last question is just the general idea, roughly, as of end of business today, what was the fund balance? The unencumbered, I should say.
Indeed, everybody's favorite subject to talk about. A matter of great dispute among this august body and the people who regularly are coming here. We're going to have a much better understanding of that when CAFR is finished.
Okay.
Because that's going to lay out in very clear detail what our existing available cash that remains in the general fund, and more importantly, what among those funds are going to be for restricted use and not available for those for general purposes. I had said at the start of the year that my projection, given what I expect our spending over budget to have been for 2017, was that we started the year in the neighborhood of a $7.5 million unencumbered balance. Since that time, we've spent $1 million, although in a budgetary sense, about an extra $500,000 on the malware issue, because we were drawing from budget in other places. So that gets you to $7 million. I'm not seeing anything at this point that is that I'm surprised by, and most of the reserves that we used this year were already being allocated for a restricted purpose, which was the POE funds, and we're using them for MMO instead. So out of the remaining funds, that's probably meaning about another $500,000 that I would expect in a normal situation, if everything goes spending, that we would enter 2019 with about $6.5 million in that range for the unencumbered balance. Your mileage may vary and things may change, and I suspect after the CAFR comes out, we'll have some more to talk about that.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Hartzell. Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman, and to the committee as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Robinson, and we will continue. I don't think anybody else has any more questions. No, I'm just kidding.
You did a great job with the questions.
But Ms. Bolter,
Well, you mentioned about collection, but you didn't really specify collection from where? You said that our revenue will increase once you start collecting.
There are some things that we have been doing in terms of business privilege tax as far as being more aggressive with our audits, more aggressive with liens on property than we have been doing before. We have, there's actually been a very large non-response rate that we are working on ways to decrease. We've been sending our staff into the field to actually find where new businesses are in the community. We have little devices that connect to our GIS system, and we can identify when we have people walking around if there is a business that hasn't been identified up to this point, so we can say, oh, there's a business happening here. and we need to make sure that we're collecting that particular revenue that may come from it. The one thing that has been mentioned by Mr. Hirschman in particular was whether we needed to go to a tenant registry, which does exist in the ordinances. And my general viewpoint on that is I think that's the idea is being actually fulfilled by what we're doing going out in the field and doing the audits, is that we're finding essentially 99% of the businesses that would have been found by going to the means of the tenant registry. So it's not that we don't think that that would be an important idea, it's that we're essentially already finding everything that we need to based upon the search techniques that we're doing at this point. We are also reaching into a couple of areas that had not been reached into before. And one of those is indeed dealing with certain companies who are nonprofits, but that carry out to some extent taxable activities, and in certain categories, certain profitable activities, and we have been starting to look through the 990 forms of those entities and have identified in a few places, some places where we think that some of those nonprofits, particularly in the health sector, should be contributing more in terms of business privilege tax. And so we're starting to go down that road, and we have some, we no doubt have some challenges that we're going to face with that. I know a couple of audits we've done so far have shown some rather significant impact, and we're going to have some appeals, I know. But we're taking a much broader stance on how we're collecting business privilege tax, and it's showing up in the revenues much better than it had in previous years.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Walter. Mr. McCray? That's another meeting. Mr.
No. Thank you, Chairman. Just one question later today. What effect, if any, will the recent Fed funds rate increase of today and the future have on our funding or refinance it? Obviously, it's going to make it more expensive.
Oh, yeah, it will be interesting to see if we can do any refinancing of our existing debt. Our brand new financial advisor, NW Financial, is coming in to meet with me tomorrow, and one of the first things that we're going to talk about is indeed what we can do with our debt financing structure to see if there's anything that can help with that. Obviously, for terms of doing a short-term debt issue, that's going to have some impact. The last time that we did an issue that was involving the $6 million 3-year loan for equipment, I think we got about a 1.4% interest rate on that. I don't think we're going to get anything close to that this time around, but we're going to try to keep that cost down as much as is possible. We finally have all of the I's dotted and T's crossed with respect to Manning and Napier and our investment of cash with them, and we are seeing as we're about to go make that final investment with them, probably in the neighborhood of $2 to $5 million, seeing rate of returns on short-term securities that we could end up seeing a net 150 to 200 basis points over the costs that are involved. So that will help a little bit in taking advantage of the higher rates and being able to bring in some interest income that way.
Okay, thank you. That's the only question I have.
Thank you.
Mr. Green, if I could, I just have a question. Sorry, the casino money, that's a given, or that's not an estimate?
That we're seeing so far, Mr. President, is it's actually coming in through May at a slightly higher rate than what we had budgeted. Will there be anything else that emerges in terms of the legal arena on that one? That's a great unknown, but to this point, we're actually coming in as far as collections a little bit higher than what we had projected so far for the year.
So basically, we'll keep our fingers crossed on that one.
I think that's a fair way to handle it.
Okay, right, thank you.
Thank you, Roger. And,
Thank you.
and I thank you. Mr. Robinson obviously asked a lot of questions that I had as well, and I think covered a lot of things. I just have a few more questions.
Sure.
One is the permanent wage increase. You estimated about 2.5%. Just today, I read that we are increasing the FOP wages 3%.
Mhm.
Is that included into this budget, or is that something that has to be?
No, I think the models that we had in there for 2018, 19, and 20, we had to factor in that there were gonna be those increases, and that means that we've had, I think it's a 2.5% increase this year in SEIU that's gonna go up to 3 for the next couple of years. Fire is at 3, police is at 3. That leaves, of course, everybody who's non-marketing out there, which does not have a guaranteed increase whatsoever. I also did factor a little bit into that if we had vacancies continuing at the rate that they were going to, that we'd end up having a little bit lower rate, I guess, overall, that the increase would happen. But you've named it very well, that the wage pressures are certainly there, given what we have in the agreements. And 2.5 is probably the low end estimate of what we would be dealing with on an annual basis.
And that includes the health benefit as well?
That's a different item. The wages were at 2.5% in '02. The health, which you find in item 16 on the spreadsheet that comes with this, is a 7% increase.
Yeah.
Or basically, a general fund hit in the neighborhood of $1 million a year.
No, I have it right here. It's
Okay.
actually, I just wanted to push that in there, because it's actually talking about 10% increase. When you have the bargaining units at 3%. So, and that's a major increase, I think. I'm not sure how that happened. I wasn't part of the, obviously, of the union negotiations, but.
Well, we're also having the economy is going pretty well at this point. And I think as part of that, it's not surprising, I think, that with the economy doing very well, there are going to be some wage pressures that happen. And I don't think that those numbers are out of line in terms of the wage increases. And it's.
Do you think the majority of the people across this country are getting about 3% increase?
I can't speak to that.
I've researched it. It's been like 3% for almost the last 3 years as a national average.
Well, then we in the, that's the case, then we are in an average.
Yes.
I mean, I wasn't trying to be facetious.
I know you are, but I'm glad Joe was here to be, because he had done the research.
And hopefully I wasn't being facetious.
Just a couple of other points. The little concern about the real estate tax increase about 1.5% annually, so it makes it about 7.5 in the next 5 years. And the reason, obviously, is because of, when we're increasing taxes periodically back in 2000, 2003, 2004, 2005, I think it was, almost everybody who live out in left Allentown. And we have a number of people that have came in the last 10 years, 10 to 15 years, that are obviously very, in the lower income bracket. And I'm concerned that that's going to hinder the tax revenue that we're going to get, and also the burden on the residents. And I'm not saying that we don't need the revenues, but I'm saying, I wonder if we can do something else as well that will kind of take care of that, so it won't have to be increased, that.
The revenue impact as far as,
Let me just finish this, because the other part of it is that the school district is increasing their taxes, unfortunately, almost 5% annually. And the county, they've done their part of it as well. Not as much, but they've done their part. So I'm concerned on increasing taxes 7.5% in the next 5 years.
the point of that would be at the current rates. And that would be making the assumption that's not going to be a rate increase that's assuming that 7.5%. That is assuming that development in the downtown core, which is predominantly where it's going to happen, would generate that much additional revenue in property tax. It's taken a little while to get to that point. I think we are seeing a lot of buildings that are coming on and adding to that total. So that 1.5% annual rate is conditioned based upon what we're hopeful for as far as downtown development goes, and maybe some other development happening elsewhere in the city. That doesn't have anything to do with the rate increase.
And that will help, hopefully, increase the revenue. by
That's
some
the
of those-
intention, yes.
Some of those, developments that you talked about earlier.
Yes.
Mr. Camino, and then however, the question would also everybody ask me, well, we have new buildings, doesn't that mean new taxes or higher taxes are coming, more revenue to the city? And that's a question that needs to be explained, because some of those old buildings, and we took a whole block down, and, in one session, and most of those developments, pay taxes now, are high amount. But we don't, I'm not sure if we are showing that difference, clearly in our budget.
And there has been some movement, I think, some movement, maybe not as much as some had expected in the first 2 to 3 years of the NIS, but it's starting to move upward a little bit. But remember also that when Lehigh County did its full re-equalization of property in 2012, for the most part, most of the properties in this city have been kept at that particular valuation for tax purposes for 6 years. If you see an improvement like in the NIS, or if you see somebody with a house that they decide they're gonna add a swimming pool or add an annex or whatever else, in those instances, the county is going to come out and make an adjustment to what those overall property values are. But for the bulk of those property values are going to remain steady in a nominal term until the next time in which the county decides to do a full equalization process. So there's no rate increase annually for 13 years on a value that is not flat. So we're not even capturing inflation with that. I'm not trying to make a point of saying good, bad, or indifferent. I am saying we've been collecting a 0% nominal difference over 13 years on a very large swath of the property in the city.
We are, but you must agree that we also have increased our fees almost everywhere. We increased we put a new fee of the stormwater management. We've had a fee of the rental units, the $75 a pop right away. And
All of that, yes.
And, that counts for something.
It does, agreed.
So, we're not increasing real estate taxes yet, but also increasing income taxes. And, that's my next point, which is a little bit difficult to think that we are gonna pay, what do you say, 3% to 2.5%?
Yeah.
And, I know that some people will say, well, I know the city is paying 3%, but we're not another city. We're a very particular city that has the brunt of infrastructure here for the county, and also have a lot of, like I said earlier, a lot of properties, a lot of residents that are not on the level in many of the cities financially.
Understood. The recent trend data the last couple of years, Councilman Greedy, it gives me confidence in that 2.5% number. It may well be if we see a recession come in, that rate needs to come down a little bit. But right now, given the overall status of the economy, I'm pretty confident with that.
My last question is in regards to capital improvement. How much do you expect that we would have on capital improvement in the next 5 years?
That's a loaded question. There's the amount that could be deemed as necessary for capital improvement, and there's the amount that's likely to be available in cash for those purposes. Obviously, some decisions need to get made. How many lane miles of road are going to be repaved every year? How much are we going to contribute in terms of building maintenance to city facilities? All of those things have to be factored into the calculation. The challenge that, as I see it right now, is that going to the debt market to try and secure additional funding for such purposes is not a wise decision.
I know that it's just speculation in a way.
Yes, this is my opinion. You're looking at this, I'm definitely giving you what I hope to be a recent opinion on these things.
That's fair enough. There was one other question I had, but I think I lost it here. So saying that, well, I know it was very critical, but I also must say that it's a good plan. It is well thought out. It's very much due for us to have it since we've been asking for it for a while. And it's obviously not your fault, you know. So my kudos to the new mayor and managing director and to you, obviously. I'm sure we're gonna have questions from the public about this, and at this point, unless anybody else in the dais has any, Mr. Gretzer,
You know, I think that,
well, let me just.
based on my responsibilities in the city charter, I ought to weigh in here a little bit.
Correct.
I communicated to Mr. Hartzell a number of weeks ago about some issues that I had. You know, and generally, I think that his assumptions are fair assumptions in terms of revenue. I did have some questions. We get about $900-some thousand from miscellaneous income. In some years, it's been significantly higher. That's pretty much been a black hole, and I'd certainly like administration to, you know, in the future, to delineate what those sources of income are, so we can have a better idea about A, where they come from, and B, their predictability. We had a brief chuckle about EMS a little while ago. You know, I remain concerned about that. It's good to hear that the non-medically necessary calls are declining. However, the costs associated with that are certainly the margin, you know, fuel, at least in terms of the tangibles, the intangibles, you know, if you're going on less calls, hopefully the stress level of our employees goes down because they're not out the door every 2 seconds. If they're more medically necessary calls, you know, I guess that's good for revenue, but we also, there's some revenue for water and sewer outstanding. You know, I'd like to get an idea of about what we think that total amount is. I expect we'll collect it almost all one way or another, either by people coming in paying cash or having liens on properties, but we don't know what that total amount is going forward. And Mr. Hartzell did answer about the Act 205. I've certainly been concerned with how long we'll be able to collect that, and we seem to be good for a number of years in the future to have that revenue stream coming in, which we do use to address our pension responsibilities. So those are my concerns, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gresham. You know, I want to piggyback in this, piggyback on this Act 205. What's the maximum we can collect for non-residents in the 205, the Act 205?
Let's talk that over, because there has been, and I'm not trying to identify necessarily any individual who's here usually, but this has been, particularly for Mr. Hirschman, this has been a significant issue, and it touches upon a particular letter that he received from Representative Schleier's office late in 2016 about the concern raised as to whether the city residents were contributing fairly to the overall amount of the pension costs while we were still collecting a non-resident income tax. I have read through that letter 10 times, and I know that the concern raised is, does the origin of that tax matter? Does it matter whether a resident is assessed under Act 205 or is assessed under the general taxing power of the city? He and I have a disagreement on that one, but I think the language is very clear, and the Auditor General has backed us up on it, that what we're doing in terms of our general taxing power with respect to residential EIT is serving as that purpose of the contribution of residents who do pay a higher earned income tax rate than non-residents do. The 0.28% that comes from most non-residents into the city is entirely used for pension costs. And the bulk of our MMO costs, even with the monies coming out of 205, are being contributed by residents. Our MMO costs in this year are up around $13 million, and the portion of that comes from Act 205 is only about $4 million. So obviously things that residents are doing are contributing a whole lot more to that overall calculation. I would also say this is a really technical standpoint on this. I don't think the way Act 205 is written, because I've read it, is that that particular act can be applied to residents in the city of Allentown. But it does matter that we have some sort of earned income tax that is being collected on residents that is indeed not making non-residents have to pay more than what they're doing. And first of all, as far as I know in Act 205, you can take the rate down, but you can't take it up. So the 1.28% that we're charging as a rate on non-resident EIT can't go up. There'd be too many other things that would have to happen for that to take place. So that's not going to go in an upward direction at all. And secondly, as I have iterated before, the Auditor General comes in and looks at our calculations every year. And what matters with respect to Act 205 is that there is a certain amount of wages that is subject to the pension, and there's a certain level of contribution that comes in from all sources, Act 205 and otherwise, that contributes like a numerator over the denominator. We have a certain threshold of eligible expenses over eligible salary that we have to maintain annually to still be eligible to collect non-resident earned income tax. And through the work of Debbie Bowman, who I'm going to miss terribly in 2 weeks, she has made sure that we have maintained above that threshold the entire time. And I think now with the increase in the MMO resulting from the lower expected rate of return, that we will continue to meet that threshold on the numerator side, and we will not be in any risk from the perspective of the Auditor General of being ineligible to collect non-resident earned income tax under Act 205 anytime soon.
So is the denominator for the collection, the residents?
The residents are contributing a lot more than the non-residents are to the overall cost of pensions.
Yeah.
Much, much more.
So is there a formula that we use for the denominator?
There's a state formula that exists. That when we went into the year, I can't even remember what year now, because it was before I arrived, in which we started a non-resident earned income tax. There was a threshold that was met that year of the amount of contributions in the numerator that the city was providing for pensions over a fixed amount of eligible salaries tied to the people who were benefiting from this. That percentage was calculated, numerator divided by denominator, to be at a certain threshold, and the requirement under the state law is that we have to maintain at least that percentage every year going forward of our contributions over those salaries to be eligible to continue to collect non-resident earned income tax. If we don't, then we can't collect the non-resident DIT.
I thought that the 205 was because of how much we owed the state for the MMO versus the salary.
Well, the salary goes into the denominator, the MMO goes in the numerator. There is that is how the calculations are made, that there is a certain wage base that contributes at the bottom, and the MMO and any other contributions we make, POBs or whatever, go into a numerator. The formula is set up, A divided by B equals X, and that rate of X was created when we just did the non-resident earned income tax. We have to stay at or above X to continue to assess the tax.
Probably we should get that formula eventually, so we can all understand.
I'm not sure I can explain it, to be honest. How Debbie did it is amazing, and I'm going to miss her in that regard, but I will bring her around at some point to show exactly how we come to that calculation that the Auditor General does look at every year.
Well, that's what we get it from, and I think that's what Mr. Hirschman got. He got a letter back in, I don't know.
I've read that as much as he has, believe me.
But I just want to make sure, one, that we can charge the maximum that we can to non-residents.
Which we are doing.
And two, that we can charge the minimum that we can to our residents.
Totally understandable, yes, I get that.
So that's what we are. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very well presented, and I'm not sure, I want to give the opportunity to the mayor to see if you want to say anything about this. You okay? All right, great. All right, so let's move forward. Probably we allow the public to speak now, and then we're going to the other bill. So, Mr. Hirschman, I know you're dying to come. Over here.
Start at 2:05.
You heard.
Mr. Hartsel, you promised me a letter that you got from the Auditor General in reference to Act 205. I'm gonna read that letter, and I'm gonna see if there's difference in what Mr. Schreier has been saying. Mr. Schreier is a legislator who understands state law, and Mr. Schreier disagrees with what you're saying. So I'd like to see the letter you keep speaking about, or information you got from the Auditor General, would you share it with City Council and the public?
I will do that. I will commit to that.
You promised that, how many meetings now? I mean, it's very, very important that we see this letter. You know, years ago, we lost a lawsuit over wage taxes when we were collecting wage tax on people working downtown. We had returned it to municipalities where we're keeping it 1%. I don't want us to get in another hole like we did before, so.
I concur with that completely.
We don't get in another hole, how do we pay all this money?
Before Ms. Bowman leaves, I will make sure that I have that calculation in place, and I will make sure you all see it.
Okay, and my next thing is, this deficit of $3.9 million. Is administration doing anything that we don't end up with that deficit projected here in this 5-year plan?
I expect that those decisions are going to be made very soon. We've been starting to talk about them.
Okay, because this is June, and we only have 6 more months, and to overcome almost $4 million deficit.
We had factored into the budget for this year $3.4 million that came from the POB reserves that was being used for MMO. So my expectation is that, yes, our deficit is going to end up somewhere in that neighborhood by the end of the year, because we're drawing upon former POB reserves to pay off our pension costs. That the issue is going to be the subsequent years as to what we're going to need to do to be able to get those costs down.
By your order, the mayor is more projected 4.5 million, so. It's that is very new. Projected 4. And you know, Mr. Hartsel is familiar with that because he worked at Detroit, so I'm glad you're looking at that. Wow. That's what got Detroit in trouble.
Oh, there's a lot more that got Detroit in trouble than that.
There's a lot of people already.
So it's part of it, I'm glad you take a look at the Detroit. And I'm also glad Mr. Hartsel is looking at two pieces of legislation that I addressed in Mr. Julio Correa, that's when I was City Council. And the one was where commercial property landlords have to keep a record, submit it to CLM and all the tenants. Because, you know, we're losing money twice, maybe. Like, you keep tax on the landlord and we keep tax on the tenant. And
That's,
Julio and I, this was one of the things that I sponsored when Julio and I were on City Council.
that's what I was referring to, everyone as the tenant registry a short while ago. There's an issue that Mr. Hirschman has brought up on several occasions, in which it would require landlords to be able to determine if there was actual business going on in their properties and that there's a fine in place if they don't do this. The idea that is at stake, as I've always understood it, is to make sure that we've got every single business in the city being registered, and we make sure that we know where they are to be able to be subject to business privilege tax. What will say regarding our new procedures of going out in the field is that I feel that we are, and I can have our staff from Revenue and Audit come in to talk about this, that we are essentially fulfilling that revenue estimate and getting all of those people already by means of the techniques that we're doing, in which it would not be a significant impact by using the matter of the landlords to get the information. I will have them come by at a future meeting to discuss that. It's not a bad idea. I just think that we're already doing what the purpose of the legislation says.
And my final point is, you brought up the nonprofits. You check the 990 form. You also get a copy of the letter, the confirmation letter. In other words, the IRS, they have to get a confirmation letter from the IRS every 2 years to show that they're a nonprofit. You require that also.
Our team in Revenue and Audit is adhering to everything that they need to do in terms of determining the status of those, of determining when an entity like that is doing taxable activity. So I will reserve the details on that can be explained to the revenue and audit folks, but we try to be absolutely on target with that.
Confirmation letter is very, very important.
Mhm.
Because without that confirmation letter, it cannot be declared a nonprofit.
Gotcha.
And then when you get that confirmation letter, they're assigned a number that they're gonna use on the 990 form.
Mhm.
And everybody does not have to sign a 990 form as a nonprofit, they don't earn, taking X number of dollars, but they have to have that number. So it's so very important that you check that confirmation number on all the nonprofits, because some of them don't have to file that 990 form, but they would owe us the VP tax, they would maybe be taxable. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
Russo.
sir.
Mr. Hunsaker.
Good evening, Glendon Sicker, South Allentown. A few questions. Do we have for the real estate tax for the NIS zone area, the base number? Do we know what the base number is going to be for 2018, roughly?
I can probably identify by ward, which would be easy. I don't have that information immediately in front of me, but I can identify at the ward level how much is subject to be collected in tax, and I can pretty well clearly identify from that what the NIS amount would be.
And what's the number? Do you want to give?
I don't have it in front of me right now. I do remember numbers well, but 19 awards worth of data does not stick in my head necessarily when it comes to revenue collection on property, but I can get that data for everybody.
He's going to get it from me sometime.
Sometimes,
Well,
We're in a different sometime from what we used to.
are you going to give me the 100% number or the 50% number that the court says that's what basically they would be paying on their assessed value?
They will get whatever their assessed value is what I will show you.
Okay, you give me the total number for the total biz for 2018, roughly?
Yes.
Okay, that's fine.
thank you.
Now, the second question, what's that?
I thought you finished, I'm sorry.
I'm always finished. The 2006 loan, the $5 million roughly, which was the stabilization that we always talked about. Is that part of the money you're gonna put into the so-called investment group that you're talking about?
That I have come to understand is a perfectly acceptable use for that fund, yes.
Okay, I didn't ask you that, but,
But you asked the question, so I mean, we're going to have somewhere between 2 and 5 million in cash available from wherever we have it amongst our cash
okay, the
sources.
follow-up on that is, what percentage are we paying for that money right now?
The basis points that we will pay on that investment come out to 0.32%. 25 basis points for the investment, 7 basis points, 0.07% for the custodian fees. If we get, as I'm expecting from what I'm seeing right now, in the neighborhood of 200 to 250 basis points on the investments that we make in there, take 32 points away from that, and that gives us what our balance is going to be, which is, like I said, between 150 and 200, 1.5% to 2%.
Okay, when I'm looking at the CAP report, they show that we're paying 5.75% on that money. Now, enlighten me where I'm wrong here.
Different issue. You were asking about the investments.
But the money that we put away, we got 10 million, we spent 5, and now we had 5 million that was called the stabilization money, and the administration years ago changed it to 2006 loan, and we're paying 5.75% for another.
No, actually, we're not. That fixed rate ended in 2016, and we have actually been in discussions with Wells Fargo about changing the terms of the amortization on that loan. We're still having discussions on it at this point, but I think there's going to be some opportunity here to really lower that long-term interest payment significantly.
Well, if I look at the CAP report, it shows 5.75%.
We're not going to be charged that rate going forward.
You're not gonna be charged that.
No.
So you'll find that out, what we're gonna be charged within the next.
Month.
The point here is.
You got me trying to get someone to complete the committee.
Let's agree, if we're borrowing money at 5.75, we're only getting 2%.
Feeling, I know what
You're
you're talking
losing
about.
3, it doesn't make sense to
I
keep doing
got you.
this. And we're gonna pay the people to do it, yeah, I mean, I don't understand.
Now,
that.
I got you, let's see.
Okay, let's see where we go there.
On the 18th, we will have the CAFR report, okay? July 18th,
Are
okay?
you sure?
Yes. And at that time, we can discuss that real estate.
Okay.
Be happy to then.
The third question is, the capital improvement was a minus 2.7 million roughly for Yours are showing on your microphone. You don't-
By the way, your time is up, Mr. Time is up already.
He was
Like
filibustering.
5 minutes ago.
This is important.
I know it's important.
I asked for a few, give me another
I
second.
give you 25 seconds. How about that?
Are we gonna straighten that out, that negative 2.7 number? It don't, I mean, somehow.
See you on Cabernet.
Say again?
See you on Cabernet.
Cabernet?
Cabernet, I like Cabernet. When the CAFR is released publicly, you will see what we're doing with that. And we will be talking about it in great detail at the July 18th meeting.
We got all the things that we need to talk about. By the way.
Are they going to show a detailed,
Yeah.
capital improvements,
We're gonna show exactly what happened, what happened with that whole, yes.
There goes your 25 seconds, Mr. Portugal.
I have 5 seconds left.
No. We got a lot of other things we need to discuss, and you're probably gonna ask the same question when we get to this. The financial report.
The April report.
The Madoff report, whatever you call it.
Very well.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Han.
I have the Bible here in front of me, so I'm gonna ask that I read off the questions, no answers, then the answers come to me, so I can get all this done in the 3 minutes.
Thank you so much.
Okay, the total amount of revenue the EIT collects, and what effect does it have on the people who live outside the city, and the tax goes to that municipality, what are we losing? The other thing is how's the study coming on the vehicles as a savings? The third thing is that, the vacancy fund just happened to mention $1.7 million, and that's the same amount, it keeps coming up, for some reason it keeps coming up. And I don't have an answer where the first 1.7 that was lost, now we know where the money came that they lost, but we don't know where it is, and it's amazing. Now, the $3 million that was annually told to us that where people didn't pay their taxes, and in the trial, a certain company was getting $1 million to collect too, and I want to know that if we're having a loss of $3 million or $2 million, whatever it is at the end of the year, that it doesn't get spent until they get the money, because when they project what they're going to spend and they spend it, and we don't get the money, and then we pay someone to collect the money, it's a double loss. So finding somebody else, that should be done in-house, and that money, then after it's collected, can be spent. But when we're spending projected revenue, and in that year, it was $3 million, but we spend it, I'm saying that's unfair. And what is outstanding for the last 2 years, we never got an answer on that, how much of the tax is still not collected. And the one thing that concerns me, when they talk about industry, or they talk about wages, or we don't make a gidget. We don't have something that we can add on because it's gone. We gave it to somebody else, a profit-making machine. So now we have to do service. So you can't add on more money to do service. The kitchen's gone, the water and sewer, that was our profit maker. So now, how are we gonna add on? Didn't I time it pretty close?
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, that sounds good. Mr. Hudson,
I have a lead timer at home.
Thank you. Oh, you can send me the answers?
Yeah, send me the answers, you can listen to the tape, and,
Thank you, you did a good job.
well, yeah, I almost made it.
All right, good.
That's all on video.
Anybody else? Go right ahead, sir, come on. He wants the answer to be sent to us.
Eric, north side of downtown.
What's your name again, sir?
Eric Ashner. I want to bring up an issue that is often overlooked, which I feel in the case was tonight. Liability insurance, you said went up 7%. There's been a nationwide trend with police liability insurance skyrocketing. Is there any steps being taken to keep that number the same, or lowering it? Is there any training being provided? Is there any accountability for misconduct?
Good question. Very good question. We've been lucky.
Eric asks a very important question. We have $2.6 million in the budget this year that is going for purposes of liability, whether it be for property and casualty or for activities that involve employees. And that number is actually a lot higher than it used to be. We're trying everything that we can do to live within that standard, and so I think that all our folks are trying to be on their best behavior to make sure that we don't go over that amount. You don't know when things are going to pop up from one year to the next, but I'm absolutely certain that we're all trying as much as we can to limit our exposure in that area, so I appreciate that question.
Thank you. All right, thank you. I think that would complete the project line information here and reports. Thank you very much to all of you. So let's go forward to bill number 34. No, 33, I'm sorry, 33.
Bill 33 amends the 2018 general fund budget and the 2018 stormwater fund budget to provide for a transfer of funds for the annual lease payment of equipment used for stormwater operation assumed section 1.4, and the payment of the stormwater fee for city-owned properties is shown in section 5.
Thank you very much. This is, seems to be pretty simple, but Mr. Herzog, will you please talk to us about that?
I'm going to talk about it in brief, and I have our Wagonhurst here to discuss details if necessary. Another point that Mr. Hirschman had made that's very important is we had not budgeted as we should have the amount that the city owed from the general fund to the stormwater fund to pay for our own properties in the budget. And this bill takes care of that in terms of moving expenditures over that we had in the general fund to make sure that we make our contribution in full. That is equivalent to all of the amounts that are owed on over 100 properties the city has title to.
And that's total to $247,147.
Yes. Yeah. So this is making sure that, I know that the airport authority had been putting up its concerns about that they shouldn't have to pay the stormwater fee. It would rather be important that we make sure we're paying the stormwater fee too before we start asking other people about it. So this is taking care of that.
So the city actually is paying this is taxes that we're collecting from funds from the various sources, obviously, that we are collecting in the city.
This is to move it over from the general fund.
Move it
Yes.
over to the from the general fund to the stormwater.
That is correct.
Okay. All right, any comments from the dais? Mr. Robinson, right?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Actually, hold on a second. Any from the committee? Anybody? Let me give the question. I get back to you, Mr. Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No questions, but a comment. I've heard some comments too, some complaints regarding Queen City Airport being one. I think it's important to note here that the city is probably the number one and the highest fee payer out of all of them at $247,000. So we are certainly paying our share. And I think it's unfair for some of these other landowners to think that they're being slighted. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hendricks. Mr. Robinson, you're on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just two very quick questions, Mr. Hartzell. The first is, could you just give council and the public a general idea of where the $247,000 is coming from? I know the additional $7,000 to make it $255 is coming from the unencumbered balance, but where
that
the
one would
$247?
be the case. The other, we had expenses that were in the general fund that actually had a stormwater purpose to them, and so we're using that portion as saying, we're paying it out of here, but it's got a stormwater purpose. Here's our, you could say, an in-kind contribution to cover over that amount of money.
And these are expenditures that would now be covered by the stormwater fund, correct?
Mhm.
That's what I was trying to get at, just so we had an understanding of that. And then the second question is, obviously this is the first time, so we're doing it this way. Where are we going to budget this from moving forward? Has that decision been made yet?
Next year, we're going to make sure that we include $255,000 in revenue out of the general fund to the city that goes over into the stormwater fund, and we're gonna calculate that, right?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mr. Hartson.
Got it.
Thank you, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. Just one quick point, with regard to point of clarification, I would say. So we borrowed some money to balance the budget, I think.
Well,
It's going
yes,
up.
we-
And now we're paying back into it, and it's convoluted, but.
It's convoluted, and it's not the way that we're going to do things going forward. There's an oversight that I take full responsibility for about not having that revenue in at the beginning, and so this is intended to be a one-time thing, and we'll get it more in the proper form going forward.
Give it benefit of the doubt on that one?
Thank you.
All right. Any further comments from the public?
You heard me 4 or 5. LCA,
Yes, sir.
properties released LCA, do we pay the rainwater tax on that, or?
Anything that has the city of Allentown title on it, which would include the properties that LCA is using to run those operations, yes, the city pays for those. And he actually had a right to know on this that I have, if I haven't responded to it, it should be coming any day now.
There's nothing coming in on it, That's what we pay on that property released LCA.
Let's see if I can find it, because Barb brought that whole thing up here for me. Let's see.
Are we charging that?
Stop the clock, we'll wait.
You got that many?
Okay, what do we got here? This one is, this one is for the water filtration and, okay, let's see, the water filtration. Hang on. The water filtration on, centers on Martin Luther King Drive is $13,680. And there's an even bigger amount here, I'm looking for the water treatment plants on here, which I know is gonna be, it's gonna be at the very end of this, the high dollar amounts, okay. The water treatment plant, 112 West Union Street, $36,860.
So there's 50 grand out of the 250 we're paying for that lease. I think we should look into maybe get reimbursed from LCA for that money. So even though it's part of the lease, maybe we should look to get reimbursed. It's 50 grand we're paying out.
That'll be difficult, but it's an idea.
So the idea is that, I mean, we can do something.
Yeah, I'd rather keep the bill smaller for the residents and lower rates. But go ahead.
Well, maybe LCA might go bankrupt in the meantime.
I don't know, you may take over.
$1 million loan.
I think you'd be a good manager for
Well,
it.
no, Mr., I don't know. Mr. Hunsaker thinks he might, I don't know, I listen to him.
I don't know what's going
And my final thing is unexpended, when the word unexpended balance, I think we should have a better definition of how much the unexpended balance in the general fund is. Because if you read the budget, there's nothing like unexpended balance in our general fund. So I think what has to happen is we have to make it look. The way we word this unexpended balance. There is no extended balance in the general fund.
Honeycomb? Well, you say honeycombs?
I believe, and Mr. Hirschman sent it back along those lines. I'm perfectly happy to have a conversation where we can come to an agreement that get past the semantics. Because what I say when I mean available cash really is the unencumbered balance, because what I say for available cash is not the same thing as the amount of cash that's showing in the reserve in the general fund, because there are restrictions on it. But let's get the semantics out of the way and let's come up with a term that works for everybody. I'm fine with that.
I came up with a recommendation that we should go back to the way we budgeted money when Mr. Gritty and I were on city council. Any balance, and we knew we had an unencumbered balance. Here we don't. If you read the morning call this morning and New York, Philadelphia News, using the cash reserve that we use now, Philadelphia finding that there's money missing, and they're doing an audit where how the money is missing. And I think, and it all started the way we started, by using cash reserves. And I think that city council got to look into this, how we use cash reserves and where the balances are. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hirschman. Anybody else? If not, like to hear more, oh, sorry. Ms. Hartson,
I think I've got my 3 minutes in.
you can only use 1 minute if you want.
Good evening, Tom Horn again. I'm proposing to council that they put a limitation on the amount of money that can be used in the event that the class action suit is taken out on the right to have the rain fee in the condition that it is presented now, so that if they have to pay the money back, it hasn't been spent, but it's collecting interest in an account, so that if they have to pay it back or use that money to lower costs, whatever's decided about the unfairness of that tax, if the money's gone, how do you pay it back?
I agree with you. I know what you're saying, let me put it this way. I understand what you're saying. I'm not sure if we're gonna do, if we're gonna put it in the bank and not spend it, but
Well, if it's not protected, and it comes to a suit because of the people who are against what's happening, nonprofit, profit, everybody, I know Motor spoke out about what it costs to the community. So how do you protect that money if you have to pay it back when the city doesn't have any money flying around, if this would happen?
I got you. So, Mr. Hartzell, please, do whatever you can.
I am not, when it comes to the matter of the concession lease, the expert to speak to it, and I realize that there's some real challenges if certain things were to go legally against the city that way. I'm going to defer at that point to the legal experts on that particular issue to go into more details, because they can explain it very well.
Okay, so, the question can be answered at a separate time. What would happen if it went in that, and how would the city,
Yeah, that's a good point.
thank you.
Thank you, sir. All right, anybody else? If not, let's vote on, I'd like to hear a motion on Bill 33.
I'll make a motion to put this before the full body.
I said,
All in favor, please respond by saying aye.
Aye.
Motion carried. Bill 34, Mr. Hurd,
Bill 34 amends the general fund budget to provide for a supplemental appropriation of $17,500 from various local companies sponsoring the All-American City Award competition.
okay, it's an easy one. Anybody from the dais? Mr. Hartzell, anything that you want to say?
The $17,500 is actually being collected from the private sector. We have received in pledges to assist with our All-American City operations, so we're putting the money into the general fund and then using that to pay for the expenses of our team going there.
Okay, anybody from the public? If not, Mr. Motion. Oh, sorry.
It's not a question, just a suggestion that perhaps would be a good idea for council to do separate proclamations for each one of the sponsors who has donated money towards this.
That's a good idea, we can do that. You got a question? Oh, okay. Yeah, we can do that.
I just didn't know this conversation was done already.
Surprise.
Yeah.
Gotta change it up.
Mike, will you, do that, please? Thank you. All right, that's a good idea, it's just for the good cause. Anybody from the public? If not, motion is, vote, Mr. Hendricks.
I would like to make a motion to move this, forward positively in front of council.
And I will second that motion.
Okay, in favor, please remember saying aye.
Aye.
All right, thank you. Let's talk about the financial, budget and finance reports. Mr. Hartzell, anything interesting? It seems like a pretty even expected budget.
Through 4 months of 2018, here's some examples that I would probably go with. On page 1, we were at 56% of collections at this point of the year in 2017. We're at 55% of collections against a higher amount this year. If I head over to page number 2, I can see that we were at 48% of revenue collected this same point in 2017, and we're at 47% of a higher base revenue collected in 2018. And if I go over to page 3, I look at the wages, and they're at 31% in both years. And I look at the total general fund so far, and I see that we're at 29% as opposed to 31% at the same time a year ago. I have a lot of confidence that both our revenue and expenditure patterns are remaining pretty constant as they have the past 2 years through the month of April in the general fund.
Any comments on the other funds? The sideways, it's not like sideways now, but the stormwater fund, anything?
Stormwater's been coming in very well because having it as part of the bill with the real estate and the solid waste fee has been an effective collection mechanism.
What about the golf fund?
That is where you may see a little bit of an issue, at least for the month of April, because the weather had still not been very good in April and our expenses continue to go up. I have seen some numbers for May that I think are going to look a little bit better in terms of that overall number, that the revenues are going to outpace expenditures in May. But yeah, that's still a significant issue.
Yeah, it's moving. I tell you, the course is beautiful. A lot of people playing. Now that we're finally having a summer, so spring I guess, and hopefully I feel optimistic that we are going to increase it as well. Anything on 9/11? Nothing? Yeah, anything?
Nothing really out of the remaining data. It's looking pretty much along lines what we would expect at this point of the year.
Any other things on the cash balances here?
As Mr. Hunsaker pointed out, you see that $2.7 million deficit in the capital fund. When the CAFR is complete, we are going to explain that one as crystal clear as possible.
And the vacancy report is still getting better.
Yeah, and no doubt the mayor has been making a very strong effort to be filling positions at this point, and we just happened over the early part of the year to have the run on the vacancies that was actually a little bit bigger than it had been the previous couple of years. But all in all, I think that with what the mayor is doing, I would expect that the overall vacancy factor will come down a bit.
Any further comments? Any further comments on the capital budget, the capital funds, anything new?
We will have the next capital report for second quarter in July.
Okay. The capital funds, I'm sorry, I think I said capital budget, capital funds. Any comments from the public? Any comment from that, I'm sorry? Anything, anybody? Any comment from the public? Mr. Hunsaker, see you standing up.
The vacancy report, if you don't fill the positions year over year, is that considered a reduction in employment in your mind?
Obviously, at the department level, we budget for the full amount of salaries, assuming that everybody's going to be there.
And that includes the vacancy report?
In the aggregate, then you factor in the vacancy to show that, well, historically, we have had maybe about 4 or 5% of our hours that have remained vacant over the course of the year. So in the aggregate amount, that's where we factor in the vacancy factor to show that what the wages we expect are going to be.
So the point is, we could reduce, if they're not gonna fill the positions, they don't need them.
Well,
They already had the budget money.
Not necessarily.
No, well, they didn't have the budget, money was budgeted for these people, it's in the budget, every year it's been that way. Back 5 years ago, it was $5 million when they did the water and sewer release, 5.6. But anyway, before he starts talking for an hour, you could reduce the manpower if he's not gonna, just by eliminating some of these positions. I mean, I'm not saying we should, but
Yeah, You gotta be careful, Mr. Hunsaker. Like the
Be
police
careful.
department, you want more people in the police department, you want more people, you have two people, remember that we want in the EMS, and we finally get.
I'm not
in.
telling you what the manpower level should be, I'm saying if you don't fill the positions, it's effectively you don't have them.
No, it means that you have it.
Yeah, well, you don't have those positions. Okay?
You don't have it.
So you might, if you want to reduce the budget, if you're not gonna fill them, cut those vacancy numbers back.
Sure, go right ahead.
I
Okay.
think one thing you have to look at, we have different administration right now than we've had in the past.
I'm just talking in general. It doesn't
That's what I was
matter.
about to say.
It would apply to the other guy. And I don't wanna call him the other mayor, but
I think there were differences in place.
absolutely, there's a difference.
I know what you're, I mean, we understand what you're saying, but that also necessarily means that just because we haven't hired the people that we needed, it's just that he's probably saving money because he wanted to balance the budget like that, or probably he wanna use the money for something else.
If you go and look at the vacancy report, there's positions in there they're open for 6, 8 months. There should be some kind of a,
Yeah, some of them are not.
there should be something where you get rid of them after 6 months. If he doesn't wanna fill them, get rid of them. Then he has to reapply for them.
You know, I think we allow the new administration to look into it and see what needs to be there and what doesn't need to be there.
I'm not saying that. I didn't say that. I said, if he doesn't fill them, he assumes that you don't need them. That's all I'm saying. Now, I want to go back to one of the questions, and maybe it's a little out of line here. On the base number for the NIS zone, you talked about a 1.5% increase basically in resident taxes. Now, how did you do that 1.5% if you didn't know the number that you said you didn't remember? I mean, how did you do it? I don't know how you did that.
Because I look at trends going back, even though I don't have the specific dollar amount in Ward 4 and Ward 5 in front of me, I do look back to see what the trend data is going over that stuff.
So we're estimating on a trend versus an actual number.
Well, that's generally how.
That's how estimations
How most estimations happen, yes, that's how we come up with the stuff for
Well,
income taxes.
it's nice for a chart, and that's what's good. Okay, very good.
You got it, you know finances, you know how it works. Thank you very much, John. There's anything else? Oh, Mr. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Hall. Go right ahead. Tell me the
The
answer.
question at this point is, because Mr. Hutzel's here, in the forensic audit fund, money is missing, I don't know how much, or was used or spent or borrowed. Could you get an explanation from him as to why that money was taken out of the fund and used, borrowed, begged, whatever you want to call it? So in the event that we ask to have a forensic audit, so this new administration has a clear book and erases everything else, why is the money not there?
I think he is referring to a line item in the finance administration budget that we have had annually that deals with forensic accounting services if we need them. We have not needed them in the last couple of years. We have that as a reserve there, just in, one of those just in case things. From a year-to-year basis, things can get changed or whatnot, but right now we haven't had the need to go down that road. We've just had that as a safety mechanism in place.
And how much is in that account right now?
Another one that I would have to look at as far as the entirety of that specific account within I know it's in 602.3. I don't remember specifically which account number, but it's in there.
It's budgeted at about
over-
$50,000.
Yeah, I was gonna ask if it's over 49,000, that's what I was gonna put in.
A little bit, yes.
Since I knew the answer and I was just checking.
Okay. I thought it was about
And
that.
Mr. Hartzell, you said we haven't used that for a few years, correct?
Correct.
And going by Mr. Hunsaker's argument, we should take it out of the budget for next year.
We can have
I
that
think
discussion.
we're gonna give it to Mr. Gracious so he can do a forensic study on the whole.
I'll hire 2/3 of an auditor with that.
Yeah. What do you think, Mr. Hunt?
Well, I
Should
hope,
we ask Mr. Bishop to go for this study?
so that everybody, there's a discussion of having the money, it gets used for other things, it has to show back up. In other words, when we weren't allowed to call it the Madoff report anymore, and we add it correctly to the sausage fund, so that everything gets poured in, and if you want hamburgers, or you want sausage, or meatballs, whatever you want, because meatballs came up from the trial. So you know all this humor that's out there, but I'm saying, let's do something positive about this. And since the mayor of Harrisburg had a secret fund, I have the article here about Philadelphia, where they had a lot of errors. We know that there was a lot of errors in other towns. Well, we might as well mention Detroit. But I'm just saying that the evidence is there that it's time after 10 years, with all the things that went on, that we clean the slate completely and have a forensic audit. I called the FBI, they will not give us the information because that stays with the case, and they would be in trouble. So we can't get any information from them. So, don't send me to the FBI, because
No,
I already did.
I sent it to Mr. Glazer's office over there upstairs. What is it, second floor?
Third floor.
Third floor.
He doesn't have, no, I'm saying, we don't want anybody connected to the department. Whoever comes in, does it the way it should be done, just grab all the books, grab all the phone calls, grab everything, and then sit down and figure it out.
I like the capital reports.
Well, the CAF report is, you brought it up, thank you for reminding me.
Oh.
The public has no input on what they investigate. Now, if we go and think about this, a good electronic manipulator can take the money from one fund, electrically move it to another fund, and me as an auditor, if I don't know all the secrets, every fund could have a bigger balance in than what it was, and how would I know that it's not being done? I would never accuse them, I would say, that's how you do it. If you want to catch a crook, you gotta think like a crook. We got 3 policemen, one's not here. But come on, you guys are better at it than me. I teached you, right? We 3 policemen on the dais, and we.
You lost me when you said an auditor wouldn't be able to find it, then why would we hire a forensic auditor to find it?
Because that's the difference in the skill level.
I'm telling you, this is better than SNL.
These are independent auditors also, and that's why we can't keep them more than 2 terms. They have no association with the city, and that's why. Quite frankly, they've done a great job, but they have to leave after a certain number of years, just for that purpose.
Okay, but that first paper, the first paper they put out was a fight to get it. And that's where when we finally got a copy, that was where the $8 million, they couldn't find. I know you got sent a copy, you sent it to everybody, where the balance showed 8 million, and it was recognized by my pal Hartzell, that with the loan from the city fund, it came down to 3 million. The 8 million.
Thanks very much, Mr.
All right, just want to keep them busy.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not on your committee, but I think maybe what we should do, we have to give them the 3 minutes. After that, maybe we should think about some rate.
Thank you. All right, anything else? Well, you know the order. If not,
One thing.
Go right ahead, sir.
I think given the last conversation, I will finish with this. I am of Scandinavian heritage, and because of that, I really do like
It's a